Text, Chaffey College. Wignall Museum of Contemporary Art, Home Edition. Workshop, Hip Hop Alliance presents. Professor Adam D. Martinez, It Was All a Zine. Exploring the intersection between hip-hop culture and zine culture. October 21, 2020.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at today's program presented as part of the Wignall Museum's Home Edition, a series of curated artist talks, workshops, and discussions featuring artists and cultural workers. My name is Rebecca Trawick. I'm the director and curator at the Wignall Museum. The museum is a teaching museum and interdisciplinary art space that introduces Chaffey College students, faculty, staff, and community members to innovative contemporary art objects and ideas. By fostering critical thinking, visual literacy, discourse, and empathy, the museum seeks to enhance the intellectual and cultural life of our community. We want to take a moment to recognize that we're situated on the Rancho Cucamonga campus of Chaffey College, which resides on the traditional and unceded lands of the Tongva people. We offer our respect to the elders, both past, present, and future.
Hello, my name is Roman Stallenwerk. I'm the assistant curator at the Wignall Museum of Contemporary Art.
And hello, everyone. My name is Andy Hadel. I'm the preparator at the museum. So let me give you a quick breakdown of today's program. In a moment, we're going to have Adam Martinez. He will present for about a half an hour. And then the remaining time we'll have available for questions.
Great, thank you. So we're thrilled to have Professor Adam D. Martinez with us today. And his presentation, It Was All a Zine, exploring the intersection between hip-hop culture and zine culture. Adam Martinez is a Chicano musician, poet, writer, and professor of English at Chaffey College. Hailing from the San Bernardino, California, Martinez began rapping at 11 years old. A decade later, he played his first professional rap show as Fame Kills in 2008 at the University of California, Riverside. Throughout his academic career and into his professional life, Martinez has placed focus on synthesizing hip-hop with academia to engage in themes of identity, trauma, mental health, love, and more. As an educator, Martinez is indebted and forever grateful to hip-hop and rap music. Rocking hundreds of shows in his decade-long career prepared him for the stage that is the classroom. As a writer and poet, Martinez is the co-founder of the digital literary zine, Por Vida. His first poetry manuscript, Remyth, a postmodernist ritual, was the 2019 Inlandia Institute Hillary Gravendike Regional winner and will be published in 2021. So congratulations, Adam, and thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I got to do my rapper thing, just make sure. Just give me some thumbs up if you can hear me just fine.
Adam gives 2 thumbs up.
Cool. So before we get started, I just want to thank the Wignall, Rebecca, Roman, Andy, just for having me as part of this home edition series. I'm very humbled to be in the group that you've chosen for this semester and to be, providing some conversation and ways for our students and our community to interact with each other during this crazy time. So thank you again for your work. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen.
Title slide, It Was All a Zine, a gif of Biggie Smalls rapping with the quote, "You never thought that hip-hop would take it this far."
All right, and so we begin. As you all know, this is called It Was All a Zine, and you'll see in a second why I chose to call it It Was All a Zine. But I wanted to just talk to you for a little bit about, two cultures that I find myself existing in and caring greatly for. It was all a zine. It was all a dream. The first lines of this Biggie song, right? Here's a picture of Word Up magazine. I don't know if this is the actual cover that he's talking about, but it's from 1990. And we see Heavy D and Salt and Pepper on the screen. We don't see the limousine. Maybe that's in the centerfold poster, who knows?
Other artists on the cover include Queen Latifah, MC Lyte, Big Daddy Kane, Kid and Play, and Janet Jackson.
But in 1990, Biggie was 17 years old, right? So this song is it's this nostalgic coming of age, thinking about childhood aspirations to become a rapper. And we begin to question, maybe where does he get those aspirations? Well, maybe he looks to Word Up magazine. Obviously, Biggie is from New York, right? The birthplace of hip hop. So he's seeing it happen in real time on the streets and in his neighborhoods. But nonetheless, he's still referencing this magazine, right? And so I think it's important to note that he found it important enough to mention in a song that this youth mag from the 80s, 90s, I think it actually went into the 2000s, but its heyday was the 80s and the 90s, right? This youth magazine centered on rappers, on R&B singers. It had posters of them, so it was elevating these artists. It sounds kind of like duh now, right? Because we live in a super celebrity culture and we follow our favorite artists and all of this. But back in the 80s and 90s, we're still elevating these performers to a different degree, right? And Word Up magazine was essentially documenting the movement, party photography, right? So at block parties and shows, there was photography of hip hop culture happening that people could see if they weren't right there front and center with it. And so I think it's important to note that Word Up was a primary source of folks to get their information and to document rap music before journalism as a whole sort of let hip hop journalists into the fold and deemed hip hop something worthy enough to document and inform the rest of the country about, and thereby the world, right? So this was before magazines like The Source and Vibe, Double XL, you know, some of these have obviously folded at this point because of the digital era, but we still hear like Double XL does like their freshman 10 every year. And so that still sparks conversation. But even though Word Up was a nationwide publication, I still think it's important to see it in terms of a zine ethos, right? That it had a specific audience, predominantly Black youth, and then just fans of this burgeoning culture, hip hop, right? And so I want to just kind of step into zine culture a bit. We're going to go back and forth between several different cultures, and hopefully that shows the intersection of them all. And if you were able to come to, I believe the first of this series where Rebecca was giving an introduction to zines, some of this stuff may sound familiar to you. But if zines are new to you, I want to share a bit, right? So this is actually a cover of a zine that I put together from my fall last year English 77 Latinx Lit course.
A purple paisley cover titled 77 Latinx Lit, Fall 2019.
So my final, I like to have the students create their own zines. So I know I see some of my students in my classes in here today. So if you're in my 77, you can expect to do this here final in a couple weeks. But we talked about all the themes in the course, and they sort of just combine all of their thoughts into individual zines that they made. And from there, I asked them to choose their most meaningful page, and I scanned them, and then I combined them all into this zine. So this is actually in our Chafee Zine database at this point. I apologize for not adding any pictures from the inside, but this is the cover. I wanted to read a quick definition of zine culture as told by a graphic designer, and also a bit of the prompt that I provide. So Aaron White, this graphic designer, he says, zines are at heart independently created and published magazines that tell niche stories for niche audiences. Historically, they've been venues for the counterculture to freely share ideas. They disseminate the voice of people under oppressive rule. I find that definition by Mr. White just really spot on, right? And so this is like the intro paragraph from my English 77 zine final prompt. In short, a zine is a self-published DIY do-it-yourself personal magazine. Zines can be about anything the creator wishes to publish. Zines tend to be created as a means of rejecting traditional publication rules. They're often very personal and political, emphasizing agency, asserting identity. They're usually mixed media, right? So some stuff can be hand-drawn, some stuff is digital, cutting and pasting, all of those different forms of art coalescing into this little self-made booklet, right? And then I have a quote within the prompt. According to San Antonio-based Chicana zine creator, Daisy Salinas, she makes a zine called Muchacha Fanzine. She says, zines are a form of therapy, a therapeutic way to share our struggles associated with racism, sexism, abuse, culture, and colonialism. And I just think that shows the importance and urgency of zines themselves. They're you know, sure, they can be fun, crafty, you know, hobbies, but also there's urgency to it, and it lends voice. It lends voice, and it can grant people power when they utilize it in such a way.
The cover of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, as well as pictures of printing technology, a mimeograph, popular through the early 1900s, and a Xerox machine, mid-1900s to present.
Pointing out way back, right? This Common Sense by Thomas Paine can be seen as a zine. It was spoken in, you know, plain English. It didn't have any lofty, complicated language like you might see in your ballots right now. But it was countercultural. It was essentially calling for America to a democracy to happen, right? To step away from British monarchy. And so I like to point that out here because America was founded on counterculturalism. Counterculturalism has been a part of our identity as a nation. And so we just see that counterculturalism occurring in different ways of different voices throughout the decades. We have the mimeograph or mimeograph. That was primarily the duplication process prior to Xerox. And we all know Xerox, we know photocopying. That's sort of the standard even now, from the mid-1900s to present. And the reason I think it's important to point this out is to think about the idea of access. Well, who had access to these tools when they were just beginning? Right now, photocopying is pretty accessible, but when was it not? And so who had the power to duplicate an idea and get it out to the world? I think that's important to think about.
1960s to 70s anti-establishment movements. The cover of the poetry zine Presents from 1967, featuring a collage of people's faces, hands, and headlines.
So stepping into the 60s and 70s is a starting point here because there was so much anti-establishment stuff going on, right? We had all of these movements happening and a lot of dissent, right? We have women's lib, civil rights, the beats, the poets and the writers, Black arts movement, Chicana movement, anti-war, gay and lesbian liberation, environmental. And I think a lot of the ways that these movements were getting their messages out was through alt newspapers and underground comics. And those are directly within the zine culture, right? Because it's like independent pressing and doing it yourself, getting the word out by any means, right? So here's a sample cover of Presence zine, a poetry zine by the Beats. I wasn't able to access it, though I wish I could. I found it in a database at another college. But it would be interesting to see just like which poets were found in that table of contents.
The Black Arts Movement, photos of writer Amiri Baraka and students marching with a Black Arts Repertory Theater and school banner.
And I wanted to draw our attention to the Beats and the Black Arts Movement because they're directly related. Because here we have Amiri Baraka, formerly Leroy Jones, right? The Black Arts Movement begins 1965 and goes until about 1974. He was part of the Beat generation. And the reason, or I guess you could say one of the reasons that he founded the Black Arts Movement is in a response to the assassination of Malcolm X. And he moves from Manhattan up to Harlem, right? So we think about Harlem, maybe we think about the Harlem Renaissance, right? So in a way, this becomes sort of like a second Harlem Renaissance, but there's a caveat. There's more anger and frustration because of what's going on right there when he moves, right? These leaders are being assassinated. So he founded the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School, also known as BARTS, right? And I think it's important to note why and how they utilize that space. So it was very anti-capitalist in that it wasn't just to put on productions and theater. It was also used for discussions, for lectures, for grassroots activism. The space was not just to make money, like many other theaters during that time would have been, to put on a production and sell tickets and fill the seats. Of course, they had to keep the lights on, so it's not like everything was free, but it was also a space for all of that political action to occur, or at least get started, right? And BART's actually only lasted 1 year, but Black Arts Movement just kept going, right? And with the Black Arts Movement, there's this sort of like leaning into the diaspora, right? So it's not just about what does it mean to be an African-American artist or just person, but also reconnecting to African ancestry and putting that at the forefront and reconnecting through the art, right? So I want to read a quote of what their overall goal of Black Arts Movement was. The creation of poetry, novels, visual arts, and theater to reflect pride in Black history and culture. This new emphasis was an affirmation of the autonomy of Black artists to create Black art for Black people as a means to awaken Black consciousness and achieve liberation, right? And so we see that obviously he founded a theater, and so theater, they had an impact in theater, but they also had a profound impact on poetry in this nation. And so, yes, it was going on in Harlem, but how did they essentially promote the messages of these artists to get spread throughout the country? We find that at the same time in the Midwest, there's a lot of independent presses popping up that are Black owned, started in people's apartments with a couple $100 and a copy machine, and they're printing zines that, or independent magazines that feature the poetry of many of the Black Arts Movement artists.
Covers of Don't Ask Me Who I Am by James Randall Jr., featuring a picture of the writer resting his chin in his hand, Negro Digest, with a picture of vocalist and activist Abby Lincoln, and Black World, depicting the bust of a Black man.
Right, so here's a couple of covers here that you can see. Negro Digest and Black World are actually the same zine. There was a name change. A Johnson publication. This is actually the Johnson that created Ebony and Jet magazines, which are more popular, more mainstream in the supermarket. And that's sort of why Black World eventually folds, because they weren't as profitable as Ebony and Jet. But, and this here is you would call this like a chapbook of poetry, right? So there's these, again, I don't know what's going on specifically in the Midwest, in Chicago and Michigan, where we see like Broadside Press, Third World Press, Lotus Press. They're all putting out these digests and these independent magazines featuring Black artists and Black writers, Black photography, all of that, right? Going back to that niche audience, right? And so we can see here, I don't know if you can see this, but on the Negro Digest one, we have the annual poetry issue. Black World, we have poems by, right on the covers, right? So it's clear that poetry was important to these publications, and getting those messages out in that way, it was a key component.
1970s, a 1977 cover of Slash, featuring singer Debbie Harry Snarling.
So moving, we'll jump back, like I said, between Black Arts Movement and hip hop and punk, but let's step into the 70s now. And we see punk coming into its own. We see hip hop in its nascent stages, right? And they're both very anti-establishment. They're both rebellious. They're both responses to disco. If we think of disco in terms of capitalism and what it sort of represents, and who's going to the Studio 54, people are dressing all super duper fancy and drinking their rich drinks, and punk and hip hop are just like, this is not us. This is not representing us. We need something that represents us. And so this is a cover of Slash, the alt zine, right? And this style, you are probably, if you've like been to Zine Fest, or if you have any ideas about zines, this type of just style probably comes to mind. So the 70s is when zines, as we think about them, the aesthetic, that's when it really happened, right? This is very aggressive. It's black and white. It's violent looking. Here, you may or may not know, this is Debbie Harry from Blondie, right? And this quote here is from their very first issue. They come out the gate swinging. Enough is enough, partner. About time we squeezed the pus out and sent the filthy, rich, old farts of rock and roll to retirement homes in Florida where they belong. So they mean business, right? Again, this comes to the idea of geography and space and who inhabits what space, right? When they say the rich old farts of rock and roll, they might be referring to folks like Elvis at that point. They want something new. They want a voice that represents them, right? If we're talking about zines being the voice for the people or of the people, Elvis is not cutting it, I suppose, for these youths, right?
A photo of Jamaican DJ Cool Herc working turntables, along with a handwritten invitation to a 1973 party called the Back to School Jam.
And so, keeping in the 70s, but jumping into hip hop, we get in Bronx, New York, 1973, DJ Cool Herc, right? Here's a picture of him doing his thing, and here's an actual invitation to the party that kicked off hip hop, right? He didn't know that, but that's what happened, right? So Cool Herc was born in Kingston, Jamaica. And so he still has those traditions in him from Kingston, right? So the ideas of like toasting that sound selectors would use when they're DJing. So what Cool Herc would do was his father had a band and they would play, local community events and family events. And in between their sets, he would jump on his tables and he would play music and he would toast. He would just talk over the songs and stuff. And he ends up inventing the merry-go-round technique, what we in hip hop would refer to as the break beat, right? He basically noticed that people would wait for a certain part of the song to go and do their thing and breakdancing. That's where we get that term from, the break beat. And so he's looping, he's duplicating these, 4 bars, 8 bars on his 2 turntables and doing the crossfader and just making that go on and on and on. Kind of like we duplicate zines and send that message out over and over if we're able to, right? But it's argued at this point how many elements there are in hip hop. But from the beginning, the 4 pillars are these, right? MCing, graffiti, breakdancing, and DJing, right? And so hip hop, if you think about those things and what's required to do them, it's about movement, whether it's physical, it's mental, spiritual, verbal, it's active, right? And so I want to call back to the ways that the Black arts movement and hip hop are so closely knit, right? So I made some crazy conspiracy theory looking arrows between all of these. So this left side is Black arts movement and the right is hip hop, right? So again, the movement, whether it's rocking the crowd with your mouth or your body, or if you're doing graffiti and you have to climb on gates and walls to go spray paint, it's all active, it's all movement, it's all urgent, it's life, it's vitality, right? And so the Black arts movement poet Nikki Giovanni, she called hip hop the new civil rights movement, right? So now we're challenging oppression, we're giving voice, right? Baraka shares the same sentiment. He says, where the music goes, that's where the people go. The music reflects the people, right? So we're talking about the messages of the Black experience, exuberance and joy, but also that pain and anger and frustration, right? It's all of those things, but it's getting that message out, right? So all of these Black arts movement, punk, zine culture, hip hop, they're all rebellious. They're meant to be rebellious. And so the question becomes, yes, we have this movement going on here locally. How do we get this message out further? Well, obviously it's word of mouth, it's the underground, but part of that is zines, right? On a micro level, starting a zine and getting the word out that way really helped these movements progress. And so now I want to bring together the idea of like punk culture and hip hop culture and the idea of cultural exchange. So here we have just some photos from back in the beginning, right? We have Debbie Harry, Grandmaster Flash, Fat Five Freddy, Tracy Wormsworth, Chris Klein. Chris Klein, Debbie Harry are both from Blondie. And then Grandmaster Flash is a world famous DJ. Fat Five Freddy is just a mover and shaker. He knows everybody. He's connecting people between new wave and hip hop and everything in between. And then here, I apologize for this blurry photo. It's the best I could find, but we have Malcolm McLaren here and the world famous Supreme Team, which was a DJ crew from Jersey. And I don't know if you can tell, but you see them wearing these buffalo hats And you might think, oh, Pharrell wears those hats. Well, Pharrell is sampling this 80s vibe right here, right? And so Malcolm McLaren was the manager for the punk band Sex Pistols and the manager for the new wave band Bow Wow. And what happens is he ends up going to a block party in New York and he sees Zulu Nation performing and he's just struck. He's like, what is this going on? This is amazing. This is awesome. So he tries his hand at it as a, I guess you can say a musician. And I mean, then we get the idea of, you know, appropriation versus cultural exchange. And where's the line of that, right? And so some people would argue that Malcolm McLaren is an appropriator and he has been from the jump. Others would say, no, he helped push hip hop further. But I think it's important to note, this is a quote from Debbie Harry of Blondie, and we're gonna watch a little clip of the Rapture. She raps on it, right? But she says, it's the first piece of music with rap in it that went to #1. I don't pretend to be a rapper. It was an homage to the form and to the idea of it. But a lot of rappers have told me over the years that that was the first rap song that they had ever heard, because rap really wasn't on the radio in the beginning. It wasn't really looked at very highly by the industry. Having Rapture go to #1 sort of legitimized it in a way. The hip hop kids and the punk kids always felt related because we were always deconstructing culture in a way. And so to me, I mean, it's even hard for me to say, because I'm a non-Black person of color within hip hop, even though hip hop was created by Blacks and Latinos. You know, it's not my job to say like, oh, this person is appropriating, this person's not. But to me, when I read this and she's reflecting on it all these decades later, it sounds like that she was not appropriating, and she had the blessing of the hip hoppers and they welcomed her into their sphere and she was appreciating it. And I just think it's interesting that she's very aware that, you know, between people like Malcolm McLaren or the Beastie Boys or the Rapture by Blondie, that it took a white face to help push hip hop into a more mainstream place, a more mainstream space, right? So it's an interesting, it's great. And then it's like, oh, but why couldn't it just happen on its own merit to begin with, kind of thing, right?
The cover of Public Enemy's album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, featuring an image of Chuck D and Flavor Flav. Behind bars.
So still thinking about, you know, the 80s and thinking about getting that message of hip hop out there and how it sort of took a new wave band to do their interpretation of it to make it bigger. I wanted to turn our attention to this quote that I found from the author, Michael Eric Dyson. You know, a lot of times you might hear people say, well, yeah, I listen to rap. Like, I don't listen to it for a message or anything. I just, like, it gets me, you know, like, it gets me lit. I get to dance and all of this kind of stuff. But, and that's part of it. That's part of hip hop. It's parties and it's fun and it's celebratory. But, and I wholeheartedly agree with Dyson when he says the connection between Black arts movement and hip hop couldn't be clearer. To discredit hip hop as mere entertainment is to overlook the spiritual crisis passed on to the hip hop generation by older Black generations. It also slights the initiative and ingenuity of poor Black youth who filled a leadership vacuum with artistic expression. Right, and so here we have the album cover of Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. There's Chuck D. You know, this is from they just put an album out, but this is from the 80s, 90s. So some of you may be like, who? Public Enemy? Very politically charged rap group, very important rap group to hip hop. And the reason I put them here is because sort of to echo Dyson, Chuck D called rap music the CNN for the Black community. So there's this journalistic flavor to hip hop, right? And when we think of news and journalism, well, at least me, I think about zines. You can get alternative news from alternative newspapers, right? The stuff that major news is not talking about, but is still important to a specific group of people, right? And so I thought that was really important. So again, we're talking about how do we get this message out there? It might seem right now at this point in time, it might seem like not a big deal because hip hop is everywhere, right? But up until even in the early 2000s, it was still, you know, now it's everywhere. But I think a key sort of democratization of messaging comes in the 80s when Kinko's decides to open up chain stores.
A stack of Rough Trade's West Side Stories zines.
Right. So now, that going back to that slide about the technology, now everyone can go to a Kinko's and print up their zine or their promotional materials for a show or stuff like that. Right. Before they worked mostly with like colleges and stuff. Then they said, well, small businesses can use this, so let's start opening chains. And so speaking of small businesses, the 80s is when independent punk labels started popping up and thriving. So Rough Trade Records, 4AD, stuff like that. They were using zines as a tool. They were using them to promote their bands, to promote the shows that they were doing, and to capture their fan base and have something tangible that they can all relate to.
1990s, Riot Girl and Hip Hop, the cover of Bikini Kills Girl Power, featuring singer Kathleen Hanna with her arm bent behind her head, along with a picture of Kathleen and Adrock with their arms around each other on a sidewalk.
And so this leads us straight into the 90s with Riot Girl, and hip hop also has a zine moment. I think it's completely in part because of Riot Girl, right? Riot Girl reintroduces zine culture to like Generation X, and it's sort of, we see Riot Girl now at Zine Fests, and so it has continued to thrive over the decades. But just a little bit about Riot Girl, if you've never heard of it, is an underground feminist punk culture or movement, right, that used zines and music as a way to claim space for women. Since it started more within the realm of punk, it was specifically looking at like punk shows and making sure that women at punk shows were safe and that they could be in the front and rage just like every other guy, right? But then it extends to the larger, right? The patriarchal societies that women have to function in and survive in, right? So the roots here are again localized in the Pacific Northwest. And then we eventually see this turning into, you know, the Perzines open up conversations about grassroots organizing and addressing violence in all forms against all genders, right? And so here's the cover for Bikini Kill Girl Power. Kathleen Hanna is an icon of Riot Girl and just a punk icon in general. Right here we have Kathleen Hanna, and this is Adrock from the Beastie Boys. Hip hop, and I think you can call them punk icons, right? But they look like just a couple chums. Maybe they're on tour together, but no, they're actually married. So this is a literal marriage of punk culture and hip hop culture.
6 covers of Grand Royal Zine with professional illustrations and photographs.
Right, and so here is Grand Royal. This is the Beastie Boys limited 6 issues of their zine, right? So to me, these don't look like zines. These look a little more higher production value. They look like magazines. They look like they might be expensive, but nonetheless, it shows that there were hip hoppers that were using zines, right, to engage with their fan base. But I think there's a difference between an established act using zines versus people within the hip hop community or people within the punk community using zines for themselves to speak for themselves, right?
90s zine covers featuring artist photos and illustrations, BMB, Chronic, The Flavor, graphic songs and explicit language, 4080, Caught in the Middle, Ego Trip, and Beat Down.
So here we have hip hop zine moment in the 90s, and these were primarily fan zines, right? And some of them you can see they have that same aesthetic that we talked about earlier, that classic zine aesthetic of black and white and just copy duplication. Some of them look a little more like production value, if you want to call it that. But I think it's important to note that these are the spaces that some of the biggest names in hip hop media cut their teeth. Like, for example, Sasha Jenkins, who's the creative director of Mass Appeal. He started with, I believe, graphic scenes and explicit language and Ego Trip, right? And then all of these, they were very regional based. They were covering their local scenes, right? They were giving space to up and coming artists. Like, for example, here, Caught in the Middle was a Chicago based zine. and this is Common, when he was still going by Common Sense. This very well may be his first interview that he did, and it was in a zine, right? But you can see from all of these covers, like these two especially, or these three that look very zine-ish, they're also throwing in that hip hop flavor. We see graffiti, right? And then we see just a lot of names that weren't big names at the time when they happened. So it did give that space for those voices. We also think of Elliot Wilson, who is now the creator of Rap Radar. You may have seen him interview, like he did a really in-depth one-on-one interview with Drake in Drake's Calabasas mansion or whatever. But it's like this guy who built this Rap Radar website, he started in zine culture, right? And so let's quickly look at some zines from today, from this point in time. Here we have Kanye's Yeezy fashion zine.
A textless cover with a picture of power lines over an arid hill.
So the zine itself becomes a piece of art and a piece of merch, but it was really used to sell his clothing line, right? And then we have Frank Ocean, who in 2016, he released the Boys Don't Cry zine, which is really stylized and it elevates the zine to another level, right? I think he did like limited runs, and it's a very long zine, like 300 pages, and there's photography, personal essays. I think this one's really important, especially because Frank Ocean is such a modern day icon in hip hop culture, and he's also part of the LGBTQIA+ community. So, I mean, let's not sugarcoat anything. There has been transphobia, homophobia, obviously misogyny within rap music, but this is a beautiful way that is sort of changing and shifting. There's a shift happening within the culture, and it's great that he's able to present a zine to show that crossover.
The Three Boys Don't Cry covers feature stylized photographic portraits of artists.
Here we have a comic book cover, Hip Hop Family Tree. This basically covers the beginnings of hip hop.
The illustrated cover depicts a bearded man wearing a cowboy hat, sunglasses, and a fringed jacket with his arms crossed.
And this started on a website, serialized on a website called Boing Boing. And Boing Boing started as a zine in 1988. So it's just all of these little connections, right? And lastly, this was not a zine. This is 21 Savage and Metro Boomin's latest album, Savage Mode 2.
The album cover features the rappers flashing their diamonds over a palatial mansion with a towering bullet-riddled sword dripping blood in place of a fountain.
But if you remember, if you're from hip hop and you've been dabbling in it for decades and such, this is a callback because zine culture is graphic design. When it comes right down to it, there's a huge graphic design component in it, right? And so this was created by Pen and Pixel, which was a graphic design team from like the 90s and 2000s that would work with independent hip hop labels like No Limit and Cash Money and other Bay Area artists, and they would do these covers. So it's aspirational, it's capitalist. But obviously, by looking at the artwork, it's like shiny and diamonds, but also it's sort of rejecting that traditional trajectory, right? Because Cash Money, No Limit, they were indie and they were distributing on their own. And so it's all rooted in that DIY culture.
The overlap, a Venn diagram shows a question mark in the overlap between circles listing characteristic of zine culture and hip-hop culture.
So wrapping things up here, here's the overlap. I put a big question mark because I want you to think about it. But just thinking about all of these different facets of hip hop culture and zine culture.
Zine culture.
Cutting and pasting, duplicating, right? Collage, self-publishing, voice, and then thinking about hip hop culture with the breakbeat and the looping, sampling, putting together mixtapes, all of the elements, knowledge of self, graphic design and innovation and storytelling. And if you don't know, now you know. So these are just these are just some keywords that I thought were important for that overlap, that intersection between hip hop culture and zine culture.
Keywords include grassroots, DIY culture, remix culture, voice for the voiceless, political activism through art, and more.
And I really want to encourage you, all of you, any of you who find yourself a part of hip hop culture, to try using zines to negotiate and expand your identity. It's a fun activity. It's a reflective activity. And I just think it's very useful in that way.
Contact info, Professor Martinez, English Department. adam.martinez@chaffey.edu.
So my last thing here is I created a zine and sent it to Rebecca, a zine version of this presentation. So you don't have to contact me for the works cited. But if you know anyone that needs to take English here at Chaffey, send them my way. We'll make zines together. As far as any of my writers in here, photographers, illustrators, as Rebecca mentioned, I do run a digital zine called Por Vida, and we're always looking for submissions. So if you would like to start practicing, we use it as a space to practice what it means to publish and go through that process. So if that's something you're interested in, please reach out to porvidazine@gmail.com. And then this very last picture, I just wanted to share how I, as a rapper, have used zine culture. I recently put an album out called Icov earlier this year. And as a merch piece, I created a lyric zine where I put all the lyrics and I put like mini personal essays and some photos that I took, and I got some duplications of it.
Rebecca.
So we'd love to open it up to questions. I know Roman and Andy and I have a few, but we also absolutely want to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions you have of Adam while we have him here. So you can either put it in the chat and we'll moderate, or you can raise your hand and unmute and ask yourself, whatever you're most comfortable with. And if we have awkward silences, we'll fill them in with our own questions.
She smiles.
So Adam, where can we find your zines and your CD?
I'm on Bandcamp. I could put the link in the chat if you'd like, but that's where I put all my merch, just because they're very awesome about working with independent artists. In fact, they've been doing this ever since COVID began. They've been waiving their fees once a month so that all of the profit goes directly to the artist. So if there's any artists in here, any musicians, or have friends, make sure you let them know that Bandcamp is rather supportive at this time of artists going through what we're going through, or what full-time artists are going through.
Excellent.
So let me add that.
Andrew.
So I have a question for you, Adam.
Yes.
So you're primarily an educator now, seemingly a very good one. Thank you for that presentation. But I was wondering, do you still perform at Fame Kills, for instance?
I would like to say yes. We'll see when we can start performing again with COVID. But the last show that I did was actually with Professor Emily Koenig, who's also in here supporting. Shouts out. We put on the Hip Hop Study Summit. It feels like over a year ago, but it was this past February 2020, and that was the last time I performed in that capacity. But yeah, I'm absolutely open to performing. I love performing. I feel like being an educator is performing. We're all performing here right now by giving this presentation.
Good. So Crystal has a question from the chat. She says, what's the biggest challenge of being an artist?
Ooh, that's a
big one.
That's a big one. Crystal, thanks for coming, by the way. Make sure to write about this for extra credit, reflection. Crystal's in one of my courses. For me, I would say the biggest challenge has been keeping my spirit and not comparing myself to my peers. And that can be very difficult with social media, and the way that social media has been such a great tool for the independent artists. But at the same time, it can be the devil, because you look at your peers and it might look like they're accelerating at an incredible pace rather than what you're doing. And, if you let that get to you, that's going to breed a lot of not good emotions, and that's going to affect your art. So just not comparing, for me, is the biggest challenge.
That's great advice for anybody in a creative industry, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we have another from Chris. With zine culture, do you find yourself liking more underground zines? Do you find it more authentic in a sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I go, like, whenever I go to a zine fest, I'm not looking for anything in particular. I like the zine to find me. I like walking around and just finding per zines. I like a lot, personal zines, because you get to learn about someone that's willing to bare themselves to you, a stranger. And there is authenticity to that. Yeah. And like, yeah, if we go back to the idea of like Frank Ocean or Kanye, or the Beastie Boys ones, where, yeah, they are calling them zines, but they've got access to great printers and all of that stuff. And it does lose a bit of its authenticity and urgency.
Here's a question from Lucy in the chat. Is there someone you would look forward to collaborating with in the future, or rapping with, or making zines, for instance?
Ooh. As far as zines go, and I know that someone from the group was in the series, Curious Publishing is really interesting. It would be cool to collaborate with them in the zine capacity. And as far as collaborating musically, I guess there's a couple of local artists that, you know, I've been peers with for many years that we just never got around to getting a collaboration. So I can't think of anyone specifically right now. Maybe there's an artist named Phantom Threat. He runs a record shop called Serious Cartoons in San Bernardino, and we were on the same indie label, and you know, we've gone on tour together, but we never got in the studio together and recorded a song. So he's someone that I would still like to work with.
There's a couple questions asking where folks can find zines in their community.
Great question. I think it's kind of weird right now because all of the great little pop-up zine stuff is on hold, or it's only online. But oh yeah, that's a good point. My fiance just reminded me. A shop called Quest is a comic book store. There's one in Claremont and there's one in Redlands. They actually have a section of local zines. Claremont Library, and then, you know, when things get back, well, I don't want to say back to normal, when we're able to get out there safely again, there's all kinds of zine fests, you know. Chafee, we have a great zine fest, and I look forward to that coming back. There's also Redlands does one. Sometimes you could find people at the Redlands Sunday art walks, any kind of art walks that local communities do. There's typically zinesters at those.
Good. Courtney has a question. As a performer and creator, can you recall some of the lyrics of your very first works?
Like, you want me to do them, or do I just remember them? Courtney Mack in the Bay Area. Yeah, I feel like I do remember them. I actually I have like my old rap notebooks somewhere in storage that have all of those awful beginners type of raps in them, but I don't remember any off the top of my head. I don't even remember any of my raps right now. I remember my prompts for my essays right about now. Good question though.
Oh, thanks everybody for amazing questions. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And I know we're nearing the end, sadly. But a couple quick, I hope, final questions. So Adam, what are you watching, reading, listening to, or looking at right now that you're really excited about or inspired by that you'd like to share with us?
All right, so hear me out. I know I look like I'm 17 or something, but I'm in my 30s, right? And so I'm out of the TikTok generation, but I always hear my students talking about TikTok. And my fiance started talking about TikTok. And so I finally gave in, and I downloaded TikTok, and I watched TikToks. And that actually, I know there was a lot of stuff going on with the idea of like digital blackface and just people taking up space where other voices should be. But when you find those voices, it's really amazing. Like I'm learning so much, so many stories and so much about others' languages and just indigenous traditions and healing, and also a lot of cool like how to do stuff. My fiance and I just bought a home, and so like we go to TikTok first and like then look up hashtags of how to do such and such. So this might be a weird answer, but TikTok is what I've been looking at, reading and watching.
All right, you might get this old lady to take a look.
Dude, I'm telling you.
All right, and then final question, are there any artists, I mean, I know you've mentioned actually a lot of artists, but are there a few right now whose work you'd like to amplify? Artists meaning zinesters, DJs, anyone in the hip hop world, anywhere, really?
Yeah, I want to shout out my brother Noah James. He was sort of like my mentor. He was the first dude that gave me like, encouraged me to actually like, do it, man, just do it, just do it. And he's still making wonderful strides in he's a community leader. He participated in the Hip Hop Studies Summit in February, and we're hoping to have him back again. And I just want to encourage people to check him out. It's Noah James, NOA space James. He's just about positivity, and I've seen his growth as a human, and he really injects that into his music. He's been putting out a lot of stuff this year. Like I couldn't even tell you what to look at this year because he's put out several projects. But check him out. He's on Bandcamp. He's on Instagram, Spotify, all of that. If you like anime, if you like Dragon Ball, he has a cool song about being like Majin Buu. So yeah, check out Noah James.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.
What an honor to spend time with you today, and thanks for your amazing and informative presentation. Very cool. And I want to thank you all who spent some time with us today. Thanks for joining. We also ask that all of you complete a very quick survey. So the link is on the screen here. It takes a couple minutes, but it really helps us to evaluate our programming and provide you all with information that you want to see. But again, a huge thanks to you all, and thank you so much, Adam. What fun. Take care, everybody.
Yes, have a good one, everybody.
Text, Chaffey College. Wignall Museum of Contemporary Art, Home Edition.